It's another Friday edition of Shadow Talk. Following on from our discussion last week on the risks associated with managed service providers, we take on the topic of supply chain and third-party risk. We'll look at hardware counterfeits, software supply chain attacks such as MeDoc and NotPetya, and problems with third-party service providers. We'll also cover some useful good practices for dealing with suppliers and third parties in all three of these areas. All this to come on today's Shadow Talk. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Shadow Talk. I'm your host, Rafael Amado. Joining me once again, it's Simon Hall, Senior Security Engineer, and Dr. Richard Gold, Director of Security Engineering here at Digital Shadows. How are you both?
Good, thank you, Seth.
Very well, thanks, Rafa.
It's been a busy week for you, Richard? You've been carted out across the UK delivering loads of talks, haven't you?
Yeah, they've been wheeling me out to various places to talk about this kind of stuff. So yeah, but it's been good fun.
What sort of things have you been talking about?
A lot about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and a lot about how you can use it to protect your organization. You know, sort of bridge the gap between defensive and offensive technologies, and just generally kind of make things a bit more coherent and consistent across the organization.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll come back to MITRE in a future podcast. But
definitely,
good reminder for our listeners, we've got that podcast we recorded with Katie Nichols from MITRE, from the MITRE Corporation as well. That's a really good one to listen to if you want a nice overview of how you can use MITRE in the future. Well, I hope this is a nice, relaxing podcast to end the week then for you, Richard. We'll keep it light. Actually, no, we're not. Today we're going to try, and the emphasis is on try here, to tackle the very big mammoth topic of third-party and supply chain risk. Now, we'll obviously only be able to touch on a few key areas here today, so we'll probably revisit this topic in a future podcast. But in terms of general structure for today, what we're going to do is we're going to break it up into three distinct sections. So we've got hardware risks, followed by software, and then we'll go on to service providers as well. And then we'll end with some risk management recommendations for our listeners. So without further ado, let's begin with hardware. Now, a couple of weeks ago, one of the major stories that was big both in the information security and the mainstream news were reports that widely used Chinese-built hardware had been compromised and used to perform corporate espionage activity against major companies around the world, including large American businesses. Now, that story was somewhat controversial, and in the end, there's been major doubts about it. It's been heavily scrutinized. But one reason the story seemed to get so much initial attention is that we often talk about software risks and software supply chain attacks, but hardware stories are a little rarer and a lot more frightening in many ways. So are we right to worry about hardware when it comes to supply chain risks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I remember going back to a presentation from the FBI that was sort of leaked out to the press. I mean, it was an unclassified presentation, but I don't know if it was supposed to be, out for everyone, but it made its way into the press and has been widely reported on. So this is from 2008, January 2008. The FBI had a criminal investigation into counterfeit Cisco equipment, so routers and switches and so on. And that's where I think, for me at least, is where I started to hear first about a lot of this kind of supply chain stuff that's been echoed in this, the Bloomberg SuperMicro story. And there were clear problems with counterfeit hardware back then. And the FBI did comment on, when they were presenting this case, about the risk of not just counterfeit hardware in terms of reliability, quality, that kind of thing, but also in terms of compromise. In terms of problems with counterfeit hardware, they specifically called out cases where they had the same MAC address across lots of different types of equipment, and so when they plugged it into a system, everything thought it was the same thing, and the whole network just fell apart, which is a bit of a worry. One router caught fire due to faulty power supply, so predating the Samsung woes by a little bit. But one thing I think they called out specifically, which is very interesting, is how the hardware procurement process happened. Now, this is, of course, for a government, so it's different for different organizations, but they specifically mentioned that the government contracts out to an IT vendor, and the IT vendor then has a first layer of subcontractors and a second layer of subcontractors, and then a third layer of subcontractors. And it was the third layer where the counterfeit hardware was being introduced. Now, if you try and map that out in your head, what that looks like, for this hardware to enter the supply chain, it's pretty straightforward, really, because it's so hard to really know the true provenance of something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And that's when you look at the SuperMicro incident, and that's why people wanted to believe it, because this being done within the actual factory itself, and those products could end up anywhere, and nobody really knows for sure who has them and where they are. But I mean, it seems like it probably was embellished a little bit. It was more of a software implant in the firmware, like it was reported back in 2016.
Yeah, it's a good point. And exactly as you mentioned, right? It could end up anywhere. Now, if you contrast that to the NSA Snowden leaks and the hardware interdiction that was mentioned and detailed there, it's again Cisco routers being affected. Obviously, big supplier in everybody's network, so of course a very, very high-profile target. They would look for routers and switches and firewalls being shipped to specific locations, intercept them en route, implant them, and then ship them off again. So, and there's a direct quote here from one of the documents that says, some of the most productive operations in TAO, referring to the supply chain stuff, because they pre-position access points into hard target networks around the world. They had specific targeting in mind, and they went after it. And I think if you contrast that with the SuperMicro thing, which is then you just backdoor everything and hope for the best, I don't know, just doesn't seem to work for me.
No, I agree.
So if what you guys are saying, you're painting a picture of sometimes very, very long supply chains. And yes, you can vet your initial supplier. Well, you talked about governments, they obviously have quite detailed and fairly robust procurement processes. But I mean, if it's going through so many different hands around the world, going back and forth, for an organization, for some of our listeners, they must be thinking, what exactly can we do about something like that?
I mean, from my point of view, you don't really need to do anything that differently to what's a good idea anyway. So, for example, network monitoring to look for suspicious or malicious traffic. For example, an implant beaconing out. Now, whether that's a software implant, a firmware implant, a hardware implant, it doesn't really matter, because it's still got to talk out of the network to something. And if you're in a position where you can have some visibility into that, you have some control over that, then I think that's how I would look at it, rather than trying to imagine that it's even remotely possible to vet all of your third parties and their third parties and their third parties.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and I think if you get into that, I guess, paranoia state in a certain way, where you're having to vet every single piece of hardware in your infrastructure, especially if you're a large organization, I mean, where do you stop? Where do you start and where do you stop? Like, if you're a company that's been going for 20 years plus and you've got legacy hardware everywhere, do you have to then rip out everything and start thinking, well, how far back could these go?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the paranoia aspect, exactly that, right? I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, do you remember this one? There was like this, was it a council in the UK that burned all of their like mice and keyboard?
Yeah.
They thought it was somehow somebody told them it was infected or something. I mean, it's just, you can just lose all sense of perspective this way. And I think, if you stick to the fundamentals of security, you stick to the best practices, you do things in a robust and defensible manner, that goes a long way. I mean, of course, these kind of hardware supply chain attacks are a concern, but again, looking at the kind of resources that you need to pull it off, successfully, I think there's few organizations which I think will be directly targeted by this kind of attack.
Yeah, and I mean, back to the whole paranoia thing, if you're worried about every single device you have, like your house is going to be empty, your offices are going to be empty, you won't have a TV, there's nothing you can trust. There's always going to be a risk element with every single product you have, be it software or hardware or even a person. There's always a risk element everywhere.
Right, and also that if it's a distraction as well. And I think one of the Rob Joyce actually called that out, this massive fruitless search that was caused by the SuperMicro article. That everyone's like going through their hardware trying to find stuff. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't feel qualified to investigate a piece of hardware for an implant. And I think there's very few people who really can do that. I mean, there's probably people at the NSA, at GCHQ who do this professionally, who could maybe find something, but there can't be that many people.
But that's not just hardware, right? That's software as well. Every time there's a new backdoor, everyone's going out there looking for it, even if they're not qualified and even know what they're looking for. Everyone wants to be out there or get that kind of credit for it.
Right.
All right, let's move on to software then. So when I hear software supply chain, my mind's immediately drawn to the MeDoc and the NotPetya campaign from last year. Now, for those who may not remember all the details, the NotPetya campaign in late June 2017 originated from a compromised software update delivered to victims through MeDoc, which was a Ukrainian accounting software provider. So once the malware was installed through the software update process, intra-network propagation functions meant that it could rapidly spread through network machines using the Eternal Blue and the Eternal Romance exploits. So, Rich and Simon, what's significant here from a third-party risk perspective? Is it drastically different from hardware?
Well, I think it's much more likely to happen, that's for sure. And you cited a perfect example of where it did actually happen, and that's also was interesting with that one. It was, I believe, that MeDoc was one of the 2 accountancy software that was specifically allowed to do tax returns in Ukraine. So, I mean, what an amazing target, right? It really, and the fact that they just burned that access and, for that operation is also quite incredible. So that's what I mean. My feeling about that is, there's that kind of backdoor, which is, obviously the sort of more nation state kind of angle. But then we've seen that also with package typo squatting. So NPM, which is for like Node.js, and then Python, pip packages for Python, that people create their own packages, their own backdoor packages, which are then it's requests but missing the S at the end, so request.
Yeah.
And then you get some malicious code. That's actually, I think, frighteningly easy to pull off.
Exactly. I mean, I've always wondered about the whole GitHub as well, the trust where, Docker containers or whatever else pulling from GitHub. How many times, I've never seen it, but how many times has it happened where someone's misconfigured a Docker file and put the wrong GitHub pull in there or whatever else, and it's pulled the wrong repository.
Yeah, like as you mentioned, yeah, absolutely. You're right. I mean, the Docker Hub is another good one. I mean, also we've seen this with extensions for browsers. People changing
right.
They buy an extension. Buy an extension from somebody, backdoor it, and suddenly you're everywhere. Or there was a Bitcoin one, it was one of the some exchange or something. They had a mobile app,
right?
And they just had a legitimate app for ages, and then one day just went, actually, we're just going to clear everybody out, exit scan.
Yeah.
That was it.
And what about services? So last week we talked about managed security providers, some of the risks associated with that, the different pros and cons were there. Do the risks here, are they different in comparison to software and hardware providers, or are we talking about something fundamentally different?
Yeah, I think all of them are different to some extent. With third-party providers, it's a difficult game because it varies depending on the service type and what data you're actually providing them, as well as your organization as to how sensitive that is to you. Like different pieces of information are more sensitive to certain organizations. So with a third-party provider, email solutions, for instance, one person may have a high priority for that, might be sending sensitive information over there. Others may just be using it for alerting or something that they don't really care about for non-critical systems. And the importance of that particular third party or what they may gain access to differs between those organizations due to their use of that service.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, we saw that with Magecart, that they went after, these third-party services. And what I thought was so fascinating with the Magecart stuff is that they went after, although they were targeting the payment card data, they didn't go after the payment card providers. They went
Right.
after, like the modernizer JS file, which, was one of the ways to, for the system profiling work. So they were able to get into that flow without actually going after the payment providers. And again, payment providers, they know that their targets, so that they have to have, the PCI DSS compliance, and they're probably much more aware of these kind of things. Whereas, some random bit of third-party hosting doesn't have that same level of concern. But actually, the risk is the same because they're in the same pipeline, they're in the same workflow,
Right.
where the card details and the card data is flowing through.
Yeah, I think the whole third-party supplier side of things is difficult because every organization now has a major reliance on third-party sources, be it a kind of a managed service provider, as we touched on last week, and email solutions, your Mimecast, your Office 365, where you're trusting them with all of your email data. And then going on to calendar kind of plugins and stuff like this, where a lot of organizations are now, getting the additional features for their marketing teams, for their sales teams, so they can easily book calendar entries. Now, to some organizations, this information they're providing, they probably don't see as that important. And as I say, it may not be that important. But to other organizations, that's critical. So it does heavily depend on your organization to how sensitive that is. And then you've got to start asking questions. If that information you think you're providing that organization is sensitive, then you've got to start looking at how they're handling that information, how they're storing that information. How do they access the systems that hold that information on the back end, their employees? And how do my end users access the portals for that? Are they secure? And there are so many questions to ask for this, and it gets very complex.
Yeah, it's really the absolute truth. And I think, you absolutely hit the nail on the head that you have to have these kind of processes in place, and you have to be asking these questions. And there has to be a procurement process where you are doing some kind of vetting, because the cloud providers or third parties or whatever are so broad in their scope. I mean, you have some which are incredibly security conscious, and they do everything right, and encryption at rest, encryption at transit, everything, mandatory two-factor and all this kind of good stuff, and others don't. But and it also doesn't mean that you stop using them, but you're careful about what kind of information you're putting in there, and then maybe you have some kind of more sort of procedural control around, like, okay, everyone use this provider, you can send this information with this provider, but that information can't be sent with that provider.
Yeah, it comes down to that whole risk versus reward, right? So there's always, as we said, there's always an element of risk to every third-party service you use. That's unquestionable. There's always going to be the element there, and there could always, or something could always happen. And say you trust your electric provider, your water provider with your data, but when you're looking at all of the actual online services for your corporate needs, it's a lot more difficult. And we see a lot more people now, security policies, they're including the risk assessments and stuff like that. But the problem is, again, going back to more mature organizations, like they're just adopting this now, but they tend to start doing it on the newer services that are taken on board, rather than actually going back, looking at the services they've been using for the last 20 years, the last 10 years, like where they never bothered doing that risk assessment, and they probably never will. They're only bothered looking going forward at the newer services.
And I think also related to this is also the whole sort of shadow IT issue, because what happens is that what you're just describing is the procurement policy for something where the organization has made a conscious decision. Okay, now we are going to buy such and such cloud service or such and such provider. And then, it makes sense that there's an assessment process baked into that.
Right.
But we see that, anecdotally, as well as through open source reporting, that many organizations, the employees just start to use stuff just because it's useful. I mean, there are so many companies and also government entities which do all of their comms through WhatsApp. Sometimes because they want to avoid freedom of information requests, sometimes because it's just the easiest, most convenient thing, and it works. Now, if you've got IT solutions in place which don't work, then your employees aren't going to use them, and then they will subvert them and just use whatever works for them to get the job done.
Yeah, exactly.
So you guys have just spoken quite a lot about the procurement and the vetting process that you might want to put in place, or the way you want to work with that. What are some of the other types of advice or good practices that our listeners can take away with them?
I think,
or does it all fall on that initial procurement and vetting side? Is there anything that you can, I don't know, in terms of training your employees, in terms of, so Richard, you talked about what you can do with hardware, that you don't need to go out and start smashing up pieces of hardware. There's actually things you can do on your own network.
Yeah, it's this, as I say, it's kind of the same best practice and fundamentals that we've talked about many times. Decent security engineering, having the fundamentals in place, that is a partial protection against this kind of compromise. I think as well, just that understanding that you have to do your due diligence, and that having a third party doesn't mean that you've just transferred all of your risk or of your liability to somebody else and then you can forget about it. It's like you still have to have mitigations in place. I mean, we've touched on this before on the podcast, that you can't just abdicate that responsibility through a third party. So, and third parties fail, third parties get breached. So what are your continuity plans? What are your mitigation plans? What are your response plans? And ensuring that you have a robust process for when something goes wrong, and that you've practiced that. I think that goes a very long way to helping you have a bit of, or to reduce your uncertainty around your third parties.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's also a level of thing that's something that gets missed quite a lot, is reassessing organizations as well for a risk factor, because your needs for a particular service change.
Good point.
So if you're using the boxes of the box of this world, like you're storing data on there, maybe at one point when you've done your risk assessment, the data you're storing there wasn't overly sensitive and your risk assessment was done accordingly. But now 2 years down the line, you're actually exchanging confidential documents through there. That risk factor has now changed. You should be reassessing that based on that. So one assessment for a lifetime of service never does the job.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's such a dynamic environment, and especially if you have a growing business, or you're having acquisitions, or it's
that's a big one,
changing a lot. So it's unfortunately you can't afford to be complacent, and it's hard. I mean, just to make that point, which we kind of make every time, but these things are difficult. It's hard to get right. It's easy to make mistakes, and every organization is learning in this area. We are just as much as anybody else is. But yeah, it's having that, being aware that you've got to take these things into account, I think is.
Yeah. There's no organization that can claim to be 100% risk-free. I mean, it's impossible. Every service you use has a risk.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, discussed plenty there, and there's obviously still areas that we can continue discussing in future. But as I said, we'll probably revisit this topic in a few weeks' time.
Sure.
And touch on some other areas. So I want to say thank you, Simon and Richard, for joining me this week.
Pleasure as always.
Absolutely, pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Have a great week.